Hello writer, and welcome back to my life. It's Writer Wednesday, where I give you my tips and advice on the art and the business of writing and tell you how I do what I do as an indie author. So I apologize for my extended absence. There's a public video about why that happened coming up on the channel real soon. But for now, let's just get right into it with a question from Patron Joseph Craig, who asks, how do you tell the difference between your author voice and editor feedback? How do you maintain your voice as an author while also accepting feedback and criticism that will make your work better? So I've made a video before about what author voice is, and I will try to remember to stick a card right up here that you can click on that will link you to that earlier video. You should definitely go and check that out so that you know what we're talking about. When you start to work with an editor for the first time, there is definitely a period of sometimes intense friction that sort of decreases the longer you work together. And the first thing about this is that before you even start to work with this person, you need to make sure that the editor knows what they're talking about. And this might not be a matter of voice, it might be a matter of experience. So the first time my Underrealm books were edited by someone else, I got someone who had no experience with editing fantasy whatsoever and had only limited experience even reading it. Needless to say, they did not do a good job, and they pretty drastically changed my author voice for the worse, in my opinion, which is the important one, because I'm the author. If you're writing genre fiction and you get an editor who only does literary fiction, you're gonna have a problem. And you should check out any editor that you're thinking about hiring by seeing what else they've edited and actually buying it and actually reading it and saying, okay, would I be happy turning out a product like this? And if the editor has listed that work as like a reference on their resume or something like that, and you reach out to them and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this work, and if they give excuses as to why the book doesn't really click with you, be a little bit wary. Like if the editor's like, oh, I know, I tried so hard to get the client to do the right thing on that book, but they just wouldn't listen, blah, blah, blah. That's not the best recommendation, because that's the book that they told you to read as an example of their quality, right? Any really good editor with a really good track record should be able to point you to a work of quality fiction that you will like and enjoy, and have you read that and be like, yeah, I worked with that client, it was great, and I'm glad that you liked the book, and I can definitely get your work to that level of quality. If they're making excuses for why a book written by somebody else earlier that they edited isn't very good, you have to imagine that they might do that with you at some point in the future. Once you've got a good editor who you think you can work with well, the next thing that you can do to really help yourself out is to write a style sheet for like various particular rules or things that you're doing in your work to form a basis of agreement with your editor. For my $5 patrons on Patreon, I will stick the Underrealm style sheet in the description so that you can read that and you can look at it and see sort of what I've put in there and what I've left out, so that me and my editor are on the same page. Page! Because books! But writing this style sheet not only lets you list out points of agreement with the editor, but it lets the editor question you on these things before they even start working on your book. Like if there are things that the editor is like, I'm not too sure about this decision, you can hash that out before they're actually in the book talking about your prose. And the style sheet will help you for another reason, which is that you have to explain why you're making these decisions. In the same way that, you know, learning something and then teaching it to someone else makes you even better educated in it because you have had to think about it and find a way to communicate it to somebody else, this style sheet will allow you to have a more firm grasp of what you're doing and why, because you have to explain it to someone whose job is literally choosing the right words. And sometimes you will be writing something down in your style sheet and you will say, I don't have a good reason to do this, and then you will not do it. That has happened to me a lot. But even with all this, there will still be some friction. When you first start working with an editor, they will start calling things out that they see as wrong that you might have a good reason for. But you have to be willing to look at it. Why do you do things this certain way, and why does the editor want you to change it? Most editors work with the viewpoint of, I want to turn my client's book into something that is going to protect them from criticism. Like nobody's going to criticize their word choice or their grammar usage after I'm through with it. And that is a very noble goal. But it sometimes is a less noble goal. As a tiny, titchy little example of this, I use the words forwards and towards with an S in my books. In the Underrealm books. Not in all my books, but in the Underrealm books because I like the way it sounds. Forwards and towards with an S, just to be clear, as opposed to forward and toward with no S, okay? So that's the difference here. And at one point, an editor was like, no, you should change this because they had worked at newspapers for years and years and years. And newspapers are always trying to conserve their letter count. They want fewer letters. That is not a good reason to make a change in my books. So sometimes editors have their own biases, and you have to be aware of that. All of editing and writing in general is thinking about the reason to choose every word and every sentence in your book. And you should try to avoid things that will jar the reader's attention, that will throw them out of the reading experience. But then sometimes you just gotta stick with something that is uniquely your voice. My best example is the word mayhap. Just so many people have told me not to use the word mayhap. Don't do it. This is weird. This is not really a word. I know that it's not really a word. I know that I should use maybe or perhaps, that those are the real words that go in that place. But you know what? You can pry mayhap from my cold, dead hands. Because I am willing to cause that tiny little jar in the reader's mind, that tiny little throwing them out of the experience in order to establish a word that is pretty uniquely mine. Nobody else is using that. Bottom line, if your editor is a good editor, they are a professional. They want to make your work the best that it can possibly be, and they want to work with you again in the future if you're worth working with. And if they recommend a change, they will be able to explain why. And if they give you that explanation and it makes sense, you can make that change. But if they give you the explanation and it doesn't make sense to you, a professional editor will say, okay, I've made my case, but now do what you want to with it. Like, I have tried to convince you and I have failed, so just leave it the way that you originally wrote it. Obviously, quick aside here, this is if you're an independent author and you're hiring the editor. If you're writing for a traditional publishing house, you have to do what the editor says. That's how that arrangement works. We're talking about indie authors hiring their own editors. But in that case, like, listen, if your work is really that bad and if the editor tells you how to fix it and you go through all of the changes and you're like, no, all of this is my author voice, but like really you're just like have horrible grammar and horrible spelling and horrible style and everything like that, the editor can just elect not to work with you again, and that might happen. And that brings us to the point that beware any editor who won't accept your changes and won't let you write the book the way that you want to write it, but also won't drop you as a client. Because that is probably somebody who wishes they were a writer and they are trying to impose their writing sensibilities on you. Again, a professional editor who makes their case and then, you know, like you decide to go with your own version of things anyway. If it's really that bad, if your work is really that bad, they'll just drop you. Because, I mean, like, if they're really good and they're really pro, they probably don't need you. But if somebody won't drop you as a client, but also won't let you keep things the way that you wrote it, it is very important to them that your book comes out, but comes out exactly the way they would have written it instead. And don't get in a relationship like that. It's not good. At the end of the day, when you find the right editor, a good professional editor who's experienced in your genre and who works well with your sensibilities, you'll just know. I know that makes it sound like a marriage or something, and yeah, it kind of is. I mean, my editor knows me as a person better than everyone except for my closest family and friends. And that is the way that it should be. This is somebody that you are letting into your heart, your mind, the very deepest parts of your soul. You better make sure that the two of you can, you know, like, get along and aren't gonna kick each other out of bed for eating crackers. Thanks for the question, Joe. I hope that my rather long and rambly answer was at least somewhat helpful to you, even though it's quite late. Sorry about that. For everyone else watching this, I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you want to show your support, find the merchandise link in the description down below and pick up one of these Have I Mentioned I Write Books shirts. It's an excellent conversation starter and it just looks good. And you can tell because it looks good on me. Also, obligatory mention that half the profit on these shirts goes to the artist who designed them because she is amazing and she deserves it. If you're not interested in the shirt but want to show your support in another way, I do have a Patreon and my $5 patrons, like Joe, get these videos 2 weeks early and are also the only people who are able to request topics for future videos. So if you want to check that out, Patreon link right down over there. Thanks again to Joe for the question. Thank you everybody else for watching, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye!